Hello. Today on Breaking the Spell, our guest is Sudhir Vadaketh, who has written a couple books. One is Floating on a Million Breeze, and he's also a co-author on Hard Choices, Challenging the Singapore Consensus. He's also worked at the Economist Group for 7 years, a while back. And yeah, most people know you as a writer, and also recently you've gotten into video.
Yeah.
The feedback I've gotten from a lot of people is they really appreciate your commentary and analysis of current affairs in Singapore. So today we're gonna have a discussion about media and democracy.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Yeah, I second what Unsu said. I think among my own peers as well, your name comes up quite frequently, and I think you're quite a valuable, political commentator and voice in the Singapore political discourse. So really interested to have you talk about all sorts of issues, but we'll try to focus on media and democracy as far as we can. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you want to bring up the opening question?
Yeah. So do you remember the first time in your life when you felt that things were not the way they should be?
When I watched The Matrix. No, but I think my sort of political awakening in that sense came when I read To Catch a Tartar by Francis Seow, which is a book. I think the subtitle is A Prisoner in Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore or something like that.
Yeah, a dissident, To Catch a Dissident or something like that.
To Catch a Tartar is the title, but then a dissident in Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore or something like that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I read that in the late 90s when I was a freshman at Berkeley, and I think before then I always had a quite kind of sort of starry-eyed, rose-tinted view of Singapore's system, and after I read that, it really sort of opened my eyes to a lot of the potential injustices in the system that we were not made aware of, partly because we don't have a free, thriving media in this country, and that was the moment lah, I guess. And after that, I started to look out for more stuff, read more.
Maybe just for audience's sake, right? Because they may not know who Francis Seow is.
Yeah, sure.
So can you just give a brief rundown why we should be interested in his story?
Francis Seow was a former Solicitor General, lawyer. Then he became a politician. He ran for the Workers' Party in the late 80s. I want to say 87 or 88. I think it's 88. He ran for the Workers' Party. He lost narrowly. I believe he ran in a single seat ward, but I'm not sure. It might have been a GRC. He lost narrowly, and at the point of the election, he had already, I think, spent like 70 odd days in detention under ISD. And there are all these accusations about him being a foreign agent, potentially doing the bidding of the Americans in Singapore. If I'm not wrong, there was an American ambassador who was also expelled at the same time. And essentially, I mean, at the core of it, Lee Kuan Yew saw him as a big threat, right? Alternate power center, somebody who was very articulate, who had a very different view of how Singapore should be run, I guess. And that also was around the time of the Marxist conspiracy and those sorts of things. So there was obviously Lee Kuan Yew trying to shut out a lot of the opposition and threats to his rule, right? And then after the election, I believe Francis left for the States and never came back. Yeah. So the book is about that I think 70 odd days that he spent in detention. So it talks about the cold room treatment, the psychological torture, all the other things that we now know through the accounts of people like the Marxist, quote unquote Marxist conspirators. Through their accounts, we know about what happens, in ISD lah, ISD detention, yeah.
So what is it that's galvanizing about this story to you? I mean, and it links to one of the questions that I have, right? Because we're going to talk about media and democracy, and you've written all sorts of other stuff. You've written stuff about racism. You even write stuff on lighthearted topics like travel and food, right? So my question to you is that, right now, let's say someone's watching this, someone who's Singaporean, and has no opinion about, I don't care what kind of media system we have. I don't care whether Singapore is a democracy. Can you connect these topics like why would such a story like Francis Seow, personal story, be so personally, emotive for you, and why to that person also we should be concerned about, the state of dissidents and the history and the kind of democracy that we have.
Yeah, so I think I'll relate it to Francis's story and that affecting me first.
Yep.
So, I think we all grow up here with this vague sense of the social compact here, right? Where, we don't ask questions about certain things and in return, economic, political stability and development is kind of guaranteed. That's kind of the implicit trade-off that a lot of authoritarian states or illiberal democracies have, right? Whether it's China, Singapore, Vietnam, you accept that you trade off certain civil liberties, the ability to speak openly, to protest, but under the assumption that the state delivers to you other forms of quote unquote progress, right? Economic development being the primary one in Singapore. And I think for a lot of us, it was always kind of ambiguous and vague what exactly we were trading off, right? What exactly we were losing, what exactly the human cost is or was, right? I never knew. Reading that book really opened my eyes to the horrible human costs, right? Even if it's a small group of people, it's a horrible human cost for anybody to have to go through that. Yeah. And that should weigh on all our consciences, right? At what price is all this development? If it's just a matter of, okay, I can't stand outside and hold a placard and yell at the top of my voice, I think a lot of us can forego that, right? But if it's actually at the cost of lives, of breaking up families, I think that's a big reason why Singaporeans or people living anywhere should be very aware and of what's going on, and which is where again a media, a healthy democracy supported by a sort of thriving, diverse media can help to address and open your eyes to a lot of those things. Bring a lot of transparency to those things.
Yeah, I mean, one would hope, but I would also argue that there are probably still people who, even though knowing this human cost, would say it's acceptable. Ursula K. Le Guin, she wrote a short story about this called "Those Who Walk Away from Omelas," and it actually reminds me a lot about Singapore. It's all about how the prosperity and happiness of this city is built on the suffering of some child that has been picked as a sacrificial thing and is kept away in a basement, right? And actually the vast majority of the population know about this and they're complicit in it.
Yeah.
So I think what you are raising some important questions as to how much we are all complicit in this, because at this point I think there is a lot of awareness over the experiences that people like Francis Seow went through, right?
Do you agree with that statement? Do you think there's a lot of awareness? I may actually contest that.
I am not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, you're right. So I would say awareness is the first step. It's not, it's necessary but not sufficient, right, to address all this. Yeah. So, whether it's awareness of the concessions we make politically, whether it's awareness about our carbon footprint, our impact on the environment, awareness is just the first step, right? Yeah. At the end of the day, we might all have the awareness and still go ahead with doing whatever crappy thing we're doing. But I am not sure that there is awareness in Singapore. So I mean, with Francis Seow, I haven't had too many discussions with people. The subject that I have had a lot of discussions with people about is the Marxist conspiracy, and a lot of people who I think should know about the Marxist conspiracy in the sense that they seem to be pretty well read about a lot of other things, very politically engaged, very politically conscious. But because their political leanings are towards the PAP, right? They have a very either warped or they don't even know what happened during the Marxist conspiracy. So I'm not sure that awareness is really there.
Yeah.
Well, I think it comes down to a few things, right? So, for example, these people you're talking about, let's for now term them pro-establishment. folks, right? And as you say, politically aware, probably intellectually well read.
Yeah.
So first thing, one can ask the question whether they've been sufficiently exposed to alternative evidence and information about, what is the other side of the story. That's one. And even if they've been sufficiently exposed and are aware of it, but maybe they're not convinced, and then that gets into the heart of the argument, like what kind of evidence do we actually require to debunk, official narratives, right? Like to give you an example, and this is quite interesting for me. Like on YouTube, I got a chance to watch this banned documentary, which was only able to be shown in Malaysia, which showed the perspective of those people who've been outcast, right? Those that have been deemed conspirators, and they had to leave Singapore. And so this documentary was made. I can't remember the name right now. Probably people can guess what it is because it wasn't made too long ago. I got a chance to watch it on YouTube for whatever reason. But very quickly after that, the next clip it showed me was a government video from Lee Hsien Loong. And he was in a forum and he was asked about these questions. And he actually, did some kind of rebuke of the account. So I mean, my question to you is like, for people who aren't, maybe not first thing, not equipped, right, knowledge-wise, to read these books, to know what's going on. I mean, what would you tell them, right? Like, would you at least tell them, for example, not to take as first faith to accept what the government says, or would you at least persuade them to open their minds to consider that the truth is maybe a bit more grey than what it is? You know what I mean?
I think, I would tell, people all over the world should be very skeptical of what governments say, lah.
Right.
And certainly in Singapore, for sure, given the nature of political power and control, given the tentacles of the PAP extending into every sphere of life, I think people should have a natural, healthy skepticism. Now, obviously, we can pull that conversation over to things like vaccinations and COVID and all that kind of thing. I mean, I think it's also fair to have some sort of healthy skepticism about anything you hear out there, but there are certain issues when it comes to issues around political control, especially, which is the case with things like Francis Seow and the Marxist conspiracy, or indeed with things like when discussing the media in Singapore. I think there's even more reason to be skeptical, because these are aspects that support the powers that be, whereas perhaps a bit less skepticism is warranted on issues like vaccinations and COVID and things like that.
Although I have to say, I mean, I think, it's interesting that you bring up vaccination as a topic, because a lot of people who are skeptical about, let's say, vaccine mandates by the government question on the basis of like this is a slippery slope towards like totalitarianism and social control. So I think it is a difficult issue. At the end of the day, I feel like I have a lot of my own sort of prejudices and preconceived notions, and depending on what they are, I'm liable to either believe a specific thing that a government authority is saying or not.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's just good to have a diversity of viewpoints on these things, right?
That I would agree with.
Which are well reasoned and substantiated by fact.
Let me ask you this. So already we are 10 minutes in, we're already talking about dissidents, we're talking about LKY, imprisoning people, blah, blah, blah. So already getting into very controversial areas, right? And just to set the ground, so you are someone that's very openly public about your personal life on social media. And as I mentioned in our introduction, you're a recognizable face. And of course, at the same time, you post very critical pieces on the government. But we have also seen, like, contemporarily speaking, so there are academics like Cherian George, PJ Tan, people I assume you know, who have suffered repercussions, right, for speaking out and for being public about their own critical opinions. So, I mean, my question to you is like, what is your art? How come you've been able to stay out of the fray? And what is the way that we can go about, especially in Singapore, where we talk about OB markers, being how big it is? How do we go around talking about politics, religion, ethnicity, in constructive but yet critical ways?
I think it's a bit tricky to compare me to the likes of Cherian and PJ, for example, because they you know, sort of both at PhDs, both were holding academic positions in Singapore, and I think the state, the powers that be, regard people who hold these important positions in a very different light. So you know, Donald Low is another one who was a lecturer at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Whereas somebody like me, you know, who doesn't actually hold any important position, I think I have a lot more sort of wiggle room to say what I want. You know, I'm not, I don't have those potential commitments and conflicts that these people do. And so I think the state also doesn't see people like me as a threat the same way they would people like PJ and Cherian. You know, people like Cherian talk about the media, you know, he's talking about it from a position of professorship at NTU. Same with PJ, who's you know, regarded as a very good historian, which he is, and so that he's coming at it from that position of power. Whereas I'm not the same now, so I don't think I'm under the same focus as them. If we want to, if I want to answer that in a different way, sort of the craft of writing, let's say, right, the craft of writing about contentious issues in Singapore, you know, aside from any relationship I might have with other people, but I think that's something that I've just had to slowly hone over time. So I've been writing publicly about Singapore for 10 years now. I would say I'm very lucky in that regard. So let's just compare me to bloggers out there or independent commentators out there, you know, people who might write for the likes of TOC or RISE or Mothership. You know, I think I've just been very fortunate. I was very fortunate to get the education that I did, get the training that I did at the Economist Group, which a lot of other independent commentators, you know, would not have had the benefit of that training, where you're, you know, every day essentially you're made aware of the right way to craft a message. You know, what are unfair ways to say things, what are much fairer ways to say things, given the facts at hand. So I think I've just been lucky to have those experiences, to have had great bosses there. And then, you know, over the past 2 to 3 years, I think, again, very lucky to have a very good group of 4 to 5 people around me who actually basically kind of read and vet everything I write, or even my videos. They watch my videos and they, you know, the videos that you've seen that are in the public domain have actually been cut, right? Some of the more contentious things, it was very sad for me to hear them tell me this, but you know, I thought some of my funniest segments were the ones that were actually cut at the end of the day. But yeah, again, so I have that little group around me that also helps to filter and advise me on my content, whether written or video. So yeah, fortunate, just very fortunate.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, am I correct in hearing you say that, you know, due to your training and past experience, and then also having access to this group of people to reflect back on you, that yeah, it's allowed you to be able to write things in a more measured, moderate, fair way that doesn't draw upon it sort of like unnecessary challenges or attacks?
I mean, I'm sure there are many people in this country who wouldn't say that I'm very measured or fair. But no, I think certainly what it allows me to do is stay, I think, so far well clear of potential libel, potential defamation and things like that, right? I think that's what it's allowed me to do. I think that would probably be the main thing. In terms of being measured, it's tough. I know there are people who say that my phrasing is a bit too radical anyway. So I don't. It really depends who you speak to.
Can you give us an example
of what somebody telling me?
Yeah, that what you said was probably too radical for their liking.
So when I spoke about SPH and when SPH first had their blow up in May this year, when they announced that they'd be, you know, sort of hiving off the media unit and turning it into a charity, right? I wrote a piece about about SPH, and some people told me that my comments were about the general. I'm forgetting his name now. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
The general who
Take umbrage.
basically
Take umbrage. You know, I'm remembering his name.
General Umbrage, yeah, exactly. They said that my comments about him were unfair, lah. You know, were a bit too far. So I mean that's a recent example. Even some of the things I might criticize. So another one I remember now was when I criticized RSIS, which is the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, which is kind of a security outfit at NTU.
What's the nature of your criticism?
Yeah, I made a video where I called RSIS and Michelle Chong the PAP's useful idiots, right? And the RSIS incident, I mean, I won't talk about the Michelle Chong one, but the RSIS incident had to do with a piece they had published, and actually, I just realized it circles back to the media as well, but they had published a piece which talked about these three publications in the 1970s that essentially the government had shut down. Eastern Sun, the Herald. I'm not sure if Nanyang Siangpa was in that article, but you know there were 3 or 4 different publications that they spoke about RSIS in this piece, and they basically affirmed the PAP's accusations against them, right? So the PAP shut down these different publications with allegations mostly of foreign interference, right? They were getting money from Hong Kong, they were getting money from America, whatever. But they were all allegations. None of them had been proved in a court of law. But when RSIS wrote the piece about it, it presented these allegations as statements of fact, right? Eastern Sun had, found to have been agent of Hong Kong interference or whatever, And this process of transforming PAP allegations, accusations into stated fact, right, is extremely problematic, right? You're taking a partisan allegation and putting it into an academic article, and this now can, of course, be cited by scholars and other writers elsewhere as verifiable fact, right? It's been published by RSIS, which sits under NTU, and so I went at RSIS really hard for this but I think that I actually followed a lot of proper procedures in my conversations with them, because there was a 6-month period. I wrote to the editor, I wrote to the writer, they replied with very unsatisfactory replies. Then I basically raised it up the food chain. I wrote to the director of RSIS, again, no reply. So I went through this whole process, and then finally I said, okay lah, that you guys are not dealing in good faith with criticisms of your work, because I said you guys just need to publish a correction. That's it. Just publish a correction saying these are PAP allegations. But they didn't want to do that. Again, and this gets back to the Cherin and PJ thing. It could have been just because I'm just an independent writer writing into them lah. If some other bigger body had made the same accusation, they might have taken it more seriously. But after that, then I made this video where I called them useful idiots. I said a whole bunch of other things about how they are doing the work of the PAP essentially, and so some people, again, particularly people at RSIS who I know who are good, decent people trying to make a decent living, which is the nature of a lot of the bureaucracy. There are a lot of good, decent people, but unfortunately they're trapped in these bigger structures, right, which have political agendas. I think some of my words might have hurt some of those people who actually work for RSIS, and so one person actually told me, I really don't think it's fair to call us useful idiots and anyway. So that's another example. Sorry, very extended description, but
I think it goes back to something you said earlier. You've been lucky, but I think at the same time you've also been unlucky. So one of the things Unsu mentioned in our introduction was you wrote this book, the one called what was it? Floating on the Malayan Breeze, right? And you also stated that actually this book was not funded by the National Arts Council, and they described your book as the potential to undermine the authority of the Singapore government. So I think it goes to the heart of the question of censorship. And from what you described just now, I mean, even if RSIS didn't censor you, but just by choosing not to publish your rebuttal, would you consider that like a form of censorship? So that's one. And how can we study and describe how censorship works in Singapore? I mean, are you able to give us a sense of like how different maybe it works here, say compared to America or something like that?
So your first question is, would I consider RSIS's refusal to engage with me as a form of censorship?
Yeah, I mean, imagine if maybe it was on another medium. Maybe let's say you guys are conversing through the Street Science Forum, for example, and the Street Science Forum is sometimes used as a barometer for like what kind of opinions gets aired in the national media. You get it? Right. So
I mean that's certainly a form of censorship. I mean the editors choosing what views can be aired in the forum pages. RSIS, choosing to engage or not engage with me is another one. I mean, what I was told from people who work there is that this is not an issue they would ever deem worthy of their time to correct. It's just not. They feel that they have enough latitude and they're charged with the ability to write this version of Singapore's history that they want. And the full political backing of the powers that be. RSIS is heavily funded, of course, by a lot of ministries in Singapore. So I think yes, it is a form of censorship, but it's also not surprising in Singapore. Your larger question is, how would I talk about or think about censorship in Singapore versus censorship elsewhere?
Yeah, as an example. Yeah, perhaps let's take something that you told us before. You were worried that when we came to create the show, you were worried we would self-censor. That was one of the words you used because you were worried that we would be afraid, for example, of imitating the powers that be, right? But perhaps in a place like America, you wouldn't have to worry about that. You could speak very freely. You could, make false accusations, in fact, about the government. But it gets away, lots of commentators get away scot-free in a place like America. So what I'm asking is how would you describe the system of censorship here?
Okay, self-censorship is very real, very pernicious, very widespread in Singapore for sure. There's no doubt about it. You talk about the NAC not wanting to fund my first book, and it was actually quite embarrassing. Hong Kong Literary Festival. I remember the conversation with the organizer of the Hong Kong Literary Festival, who they invited me to kind of launch my book in Hong Kong, and then they're like, "Hey, how come your NAC doesn't want to pay for your flight here? They pay for every Singaporean's flight when they're you're essentially representing Singapore in a way, right? You're as a Singaporean author going overseas. How come you don't pay for your flight?" I said, I don't know. It's like this kind of embarrassing exchange I had to have with them, and then Hong Kong, the HK Literary Festival ended up, sponsoring my flight there, so these small things are kind of annoying and silly, and I think that's a different kind of self-censorship. I'll talk about media and written forms of self-censorship in a while, but I think the system at large, right? There are a lot of bureaucrats, administrators who practice very aggressive self-censorship, So nobody got a call from upstairs telling them not to approve my book, right? It's somebody just deciding that it might be a career-limiting move if they just deciding in their own little head. And I think in Singapore there's a lot of that going on. It's not just in the civil service and related agencies and all that, but I think it goes on in many parts of the media, right? It goes on. The government now funds so much media, not just traditional media, but new media as well. Instagram influencers, people on Facebook, likes of SGAG. That there's so much government money running through all these people, right? And what effect does that ultimately have on their independence, on their editorial decisions? I think this is something that we really need to think about when we think about the media at large in Singapore. It's not just what we think about as the traditional mainstream media. Now, in terms of actual writing, sorry, did you want to?
Talk about writing. Yeah.
So I just didn't want to go on a super long monologue.
No,
but
just go.
Okay. In terms of writing, right? I think the first thing I would say is that there's some form of self-censorship in a lot of places. I think it's important to recognize that. You know, there was this great article about Rupert Murdoch and Fox and all his properties, and the writer used a phrase called anticipatory censorship. So you know, the writer said that over time, a lot of the editors who end up rising the ranks, right, in any of Murdoch's properties are the ones who are you know, who know how to practice anticipatory censorship. They end up, you know, in some shape or form parroting the views that they think he might like, essentially. So it's important to recognize that, you know, whoever's funding the media and who ultimately will have some influence on the way anybody in that organization thinks about expression, right? You don't want to piss off the boss, right? So there's some element of that that we need to consider. Obviously, you know, in Singapore, it is much more pernicious, much more widespread than in other democracies. I don't know whether I could compare it to other authoritarian states or other illiberal democracies, but certainly if you compare us to liberal democracies, self-censorship here is much worse, for sure, right? I don't think there's any question about it. And what effect does it have? I think it affects writers and their creativity, their ability to improve as a thinker, as a writer. It obviously also affects the end product, you know, it affects the end product. Now, I mean, there's you mentioned in your question that, oh, you know, if we were sitting in the States, we could just have a show where we spread and discuss, you know, unverified falsehoods and things like that,
I
right?
mean, the freedom is there, like, it exists, yeah.
So, I mean, the flip side is some people would say that it's important to have more safeguards in place and important to have some degree of self-censorship in place as well, which is also true. But my view would be that in Singapore we are so far to one end of the spectrum that there's actually a lot more space to allow discourse to open up, you know. Yeah.
Just to clarify, anyway, the thing about what I said about comparison to America, I think also it's a more nuanced picture than that. So when we talk about principles about free speech, there is meant to be legal limitations as well. So you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, for example, right? And you can't have incitement to violence and hate speech. And I can give one example where this talk show host, Alex Jones, was taken to task because he came up with a lot of lies about the Sandy Hook massacre, and he was eventually taken to court. And so that's one case. It's just that in America, it's very hard to get successful litigations. So that is actually more of the flaw of the system. It's that it's very hard to, you know, say if a religious pastor made some lies about COVID vaccines, it's just that it's going to take a lot of trouble to bring this person to court and go through the whole system of getting that person, you know, for convicted for, say, spreading a falsehood. So it's just more about that in the case of America. I think that's what's missing, because to a lot of people, I think they get scared. They think that, oh, if we want more free speech, it means anyone can say anything and becomes chaotic and anarchic, you know, like chaos, like in a place like America. I think that's where a lot of misconceptions comes from.
I think for me, I think that the real problem, whether you look at America or Singapore, is the fact that the profit motive drives everything. You know, like people who work in the media in the US, they have to do certain things, like the information they give has to be entertaining, you know, and they're beholden to advertisers. And I think that, it distorts the information landscape in a certain way. And in Singapore, I don't know, because we're trying to talk about large structures here, right? So for me, the largest structure we can talk about is capitalism. And Singapore, as a country that is devoted to capitalistic growth, and the government, that is sort of one of their primary agendas, that does shape our media landscape as well, that overall system, because like a lot of the press here, like there'll be no way that you could, let's say, question the fossil fuel industry here, you know, that's because so much of our growth is dependent on that. So yeah, I was, you know, wondering, you know, for you, like, what do you see is the opportunity to break free of this straitjacket that this profit motive imposes on both media and democracy?
Yeah. No, I think it's a very important point you brought up about Singapore and corporations. You know, I think we sometimes think about censorship in terms of the government and the PAP, but there's a lot of self-censorship when it comes to writing about companies who are some of their biggest advertisers. You know, there are specific examples in the past few years. You know, has there been really good journalism on, for example, SIA through all the troubles that it has had during COVID and the incredible amounts of taxpayer money that essentially been funneled towards SIA? Has there been good journalism that's actually analyzed that and questioned that? No, not really. And even insurers, anything that happens with insurance companies as well. There was a big debate last year, I think, or early this year, between SMA, the Singapore Medical Association, on one side, and insurers on the other side, NTUC Income and all these other insurance companies, arguing about why premiums kept going up, right? The insurance companies had always said it's because of rising healthcare costs, and SMA, came up with this long report saying it's, healthcare costs haven't actually been going up, but your bloody salaries have been going up. That's why premiums have been going up to pay higher and higher salaries for all the insurance executives. But this issue was hardly covered by the media, right? And not just the mainstream media, but the alternative media as well. There was hardly any coverage of this issue, and I think part of the reason is that the insurance firms are such big advertisers on all these media channels, mainstream and alternative. So it's a very good point. I think if we kind of look at like the long arc of media funding, right? We're coming off the back now of like 200 years of like ad-driven models, essentially, right? So people say that ad-driven models really rose in the early 1800s, and in the last 15 to 20 years, partly because of the rise of Google and Facebook, ad-driven models have been decimated all over the world. But it's always been the case that the source of funding has had an influence on editorial direction. So what they say is that sort of early 20th century, so early 1900s, a lot of the advertising, because it was based on daily circulation, it tended towards very sensationalized crime stories, that in parts of the West. Then what they say with the ad-driven model, which gets to your point about capitalism as well, is that it actually lent itself to a lot of editorial coverage promoting a sort of a consumption-based lifestyle, right? That's what happened with your ad-driven models, and people make the same criticism today as well of, what are the funding models that kind of make sense today? You're seeing a lot of like sort of reader-funded, independent type, whether it's Substack newsletters or even whether it's successful digital publications like the New York Times, right? What's ultimately happening is that these successful publications are becoming dependent on their readers for funding. But the argument made now is that the problem is that that's also having an influence on the editorial, because you're potentially becoming more ideologically driven. So I know the New York Times, it's been a big concern for them over the past 15 years that what happens if all your readers are a bunch of lefties who love commentaries that wallop Trump, right? Are you just going to keep feeding them more and more commentaries that whack Trump? So I think I don't think anybody has the grand answer to your question, because I think that some people are thinking of funding media through general taxation. Some people are thinking of funding media through Silicon Valley, right? Getting Google and Facebook and all that to pay sums of money to publishers because they apparently have taken a lot of the advertising dollar. I don't think there's an answer right now. It's a big problem all over the world. But I think it's important to recognize that whoever funds you, you are eventually going to be affected editorially by that. So today the problem is reader-funded models as well.
By the way, before we get more into the weeds of this, I was wondering if you had a working definition of what media is. Because these days, that term could be very broad, right? Like, would you consider video games to be a form of media? Facebook and Google, they are considered media companies to some extent as well. I'm curious what your definition of media is.
It's all of the above lah. It's all of the above. I think sometimes people have this argument about, is Facebook a platform or a publisher, and I think it's at some level a bit of a semantic, silly argument. It doesn't, you know, it's all in some way consumption that way. Yeah, so video games as well, for sure. It's a form of media.
So I want to just throw out something, to propose something for us to use as a working definition during this conversation. It's from the writer George Saunders. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah. Actually, I am.
He actually wrote.
A little bit.
He wrote one of the best essays on media that I've read. It's called "The Braindead Megaphone."
Oh yeah.
Have you heard of it?
Yeah. The guy, you know, it's Gundu walks in with a big megaphone and drowns out everybody else.
Okay, so in this essay, he defines media as the voices of hundreds of people that we have not met coming to us through high-tech devices. You know, that's just his very simple way of putting it. And yeah, I mean, I feel it's a definition we can work with, you know.
Yeah, say again.
I don't know literally like verbatim what he said, but
yeah.
roughly it's like the voices of hundreds of strangers that we don't know from far away that come to us every single day through high-tech devices. You know, whether it's radio, television, our smartphone, and so going back to his metaphor, which I'll describe because I think it's quite vivid. He imagines that we are all at a party. And at a party, everyone comes with their own rich experiences. I have my own experience, my own expertise. We have discussions about topics. Interesting things come up. And yeah, it's fun, right? We're exchanging perspectives. And then all of a sudden, this guy comes in with a megaphone. And he just starts talking very loudly about stuff. And because he has the megaphone, like our brains and our minds start being taken over by what he's saying. Like we are not able to have our own conversation. And we start needing to start using the phrases that he uses. I mean, if he ends every sentence with, and so it went on, we start picking up that language. And so George Saunders is suggesting that the media is that megaphone. And so, why I want to bring it up is because you talk about different funding models for the New York Times and whatever, maybe it doesn't matter what the funding model is. Maybe the problem is the fact that the New York Times is now this big megaphone. And whatever gets sent out through that just dominates the conversation and drowns out all these nuanced perspectives that we could have.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you've touched on probably the biggest problem in today's social media-driven world is that there are a lot of people with megaphones, and it's hard to kind of navigate through that sometimes. And I think one thing I often say with the media is that, and about speech in general, right, is that it's no longer about the freedom of speech, but it's about making sure we have the freedom to listen to diverse viewpoints, and it's a very different thing because the first one can sometimes block out the second, right? Freedom of speech, and because of existing power structures in society, whether they are corporate power structures that benefit the likes of the New York Times, or whether they are political power structures that might benefit the PAP, because of those power structures, freedom of speech can often mean that those powerful bodies are the ones that dominate, right? And actually, in order to build a healthy democracy, we actually need to have the freedom to listen to all the diverse groups in society, including all those without power who may not have access, whether they are, disadvantaged sexual minority groups or disadvantaged ethnic groups, whatever. We need to find a way to allow all those different voices to be heard, which is sometimes the big problem, actually.
Yeah.
But just to follow on from that question, right? The establishment may actually argue against you and say, we do put those voices on our national television shows. We showcase voices of ethnic minorities, etc. Sometimes they fight back and they say that we've done that, due diligence, but they just, don't want certain desirable norms or attitudes to be promoted. So one example, LGBTQ, for example.
Yeah.
So how would you respond to that? Because they may try to counter against that perspective that they are not surfacing such disadvantaged voices, for example? I mean, there's enough. There's
in
enough.
Singapore,
okay, just to use a real example, right? There's enough Channel News Asia featurettes on racism, on poverty. I mean, we can't deny these things do exist. They do try to put up certain features on it. They have had one of our co-hosts, Saunders, on air for close to an hour-long feature on racism. So, you know, I even put it to him. I asked him about his experience being on that show. So, but I want to hear it from you, right? Like, I'm sure they would. I mean, you have friends in the establishment. They would probably disagree with you in that regard.
Disagree with me in which regard?
In the sense that
they don't cover all these
yeah, like they don't cover these
so-called
issues, or they don't raise
contentious
the
issues.
voices of disadvantaged people. Yeah.
Well, I think so I have two comments to that. First, they always have to get the stamp of approval from above, right? So let's just look at inequality, for example, right? Inequality is something that people have been writing about in Singapore since the mid-2000s at least, you know, in a big way. But the media only really started covering it properly, I would say, in the last 5-6 years maybe. And that's very clearly after they got the go-ahead from the powers that be, right? So now in Singapore today, it's fine to talk about inequality. It's you know, we accept it as an issue, but it took a long time to get there. So I think that's the issue in Singapore. The second response I would have to what you said is that the characterizations and descriptions of this group, right, are always in the government sanctioned mold. So if we talk about racism, it's in the government sanctioned way of talking about racism. If we want to talk about LGBTQ rights, it's in the government sanctioned way of talking about LGBTQ rights, which is different, which unfortunately, you know, in Singapore today is actually just reflecting a very partisan viewpoint, a PAP viewpoint of the issue. And it's not representative of where society is or where society actually should be going, you know. So that would be my response to that. Yeah.
I just wanted to read out George Saunders' solution to this, his antidote to the megaphone. And it's because, you know, he actually accepts that what we don't want is to legislate it away. We don't want to restrict people's freedom to listen or tune in to anything that they might choose to, right?
Yeah.
No matter how brain dead it might be. So what he says is, what I propose as an antidote is simply awareness of the megaphonic tendency and discussion of same, every well thought out rebuttal to dogma, every scrap of intelligent logic, every absurdist reduction of some bullying stance is the antidote. Every request for the clarification of the vague, every poke at smug banality, every pen stroke in the document under revision is the antidote. This battle, like any great moral battle, will be won, if won, not with some easy corrective tidal wave of total righteousness, but with small drops of specificity and aplomb and correct logic, delivered titrationally by many of us all at once. I mean, I just love what you wrote there, because it's, you know, he's basically saying we all have the responsibility of raising the intelligence of the discourse that we are consuming.
Yeah.
And if we're not getting it from the media, we should turn it off and create our own discourse.
Titrationally.
Titrationally.
That's the only time outside of the science lab I've heard that word used.
Actually, I like where this discussion is going. So please respond first, and I have something to offer as well.
Okay. Because I just thought of a very good concrete example to share on that previous point about, you know, does CNA talk about racism, for example, okay?
Yeah.
So the big issue with how racism is discussed in Singapore, and you can look at it in terms of an ahistorical approach versus a historical approach, okay? So the mainstream media in Singapore will only use an ahistorical approach, right? So what I mean by that is that this is the state of affairs where we are today. Let's see what we can do moving forward from here to address it. they are completely ignorant of the historical approach, which is let's interrogate our history to see why we got to this place, what might Lee Kuan Yew have said, what kind of policies might Lee Kuan Yew have implemented in the 80s or 90s. So the famous one, of course, is deciding that, you know, Singapore is successful because we are a Chinese majority country and we will always remain a Chinese majority country, and because of that, giving preferences to ethnic Chinese in terms of immigration, right? Maintaining the ethnic quotas in our country. That's the most obvious example, but there are other examples of things he has said and done that have benefited the Chinese to the detriment of the other ethnic groups. So that's a very, you know, mainstream media, yes, they'll talk about racism, but they'll never interrogate the historical background for why we are where we are today.
This is a quick plug-in to our viewers. Please look at our video, Chinese Privilege in Singapore with Aaron Ho. There is actually a good segment of our talk there about Lee Kuan Yew's racist past, let's put it that way. So actually, Unsu, I like the point that you brought up, and it actually dovetails with some of the things that we want to talk about. So first thing I want to say, Sudhir, right? So on your YouTube channel, right, just now as you mentioned, you created a lot of videos, and I'm just going to, you know, cite out some of your titles, right? Like, for example, you have one video called "To Help the PAP and Singapore Improve, I'm Voting Opposition. If I vote for opposition, will I lose my job? Will Singapore collapse?" Right? And what I want to ask you, because it goes along with what Unsu was talking about, I think this idea that we want to create our own intellectual content to rebut, right, the official narrative, it seems like to me that there's a certain style of content that needs to be created and curated. Because just to use a very real example of you, Unsu, when I shared, say, your writing on Raisha Khan's incident, right, and you talk a lot about like how we need to look at the truths behind the incident, like to a lot of my friends, they found it very hard to understand your essay. To a lot of Singaporeans, when they look at the Raisha Khan saga, they just ask the questions like, did she lie? Oh, she lied, that's it, you know, like that's the end of the question. So it's like the way that they've been viewing this incident is very simple. It's very kind of like one-dimensional in my view, right? They're not asking bigger questions about, you know, what is the reasons behind what's happening. You know, is the whole thing even framed in a fair, objective manner by the media? So that's why, going back to you, Sudhir, what I'm trying to ask is that since we need independent media to do the job, you know, do you think there's certain kinds of content? And you know, one of the things that you talk about before with me was like, why do people like Xia Xue, for example, get thousands of views, whereas a channel like ours obviously will not get that kind of viewership, right? Do we need to change the way that we're talking to people to make our content more digestible, more relatable? I mean, your videos are pretty short. You speak very strong Singlish in some of them. You use very local jokes. So that's what I'm asking. Like, do we need to make even our content more entertainment? What do you call it? Infotainment. Like, yeah.
I like the word infotainment. I
Right.
actually use it sometimes to
Right.
describe what I'm going for in my videos.
Right.
There's one line I like, which I was in my research this morning, which is good journalism is a balance. Is a balance between telling the audience what they want to hear and what they need to know. And I think, you know, yes to everything you've said. So I think you could argue that US talk show hosts, people like Jon Stewart, are probably in a way the pioneers in this era of trying to bridge that divide between what they need to know and what they want to hear, right? And finding a good balance between that. But yeah, absolutely. I think, and at a personal level, I guess, you know, one thing that pushed me into video is that I kind of was observing a lot of the older writers that I know, some of my mentors as well, and you know, just over the past 10 to 15 years, them, in my opinion, in my viewing, not that they admitted this to me, but maybe, you know, being caught a bit flat-footed by the rise in video and the rise of video commentaries and YouTube stars and all the rest of it. You know, the Nas dailies of the world, so much money kind of flowing towards the Nas dailies of the world, versus like, you know, people who actually know a lot more about those subject areas, but, you know, don't have the style, don't have the pizzazz, you know, aren't on video. So how do you deal with that shift that is going on right now, right? I mean, I think that's what forced me to realize that the way to deal with it is to actually, you know, go and fight on that format, but with deeper, more substantive content, lah, right? But you need to have that mix, lah. You need to have that mix. I think at the same time, you know, it won't appeal to everybody. So I think some people will just always prefer the drier form of writing or video commentary. So I think we also need to be aware of that. But I think the larger question of making important information digestible and accessible to people everywhere is an important one. It's a very important one.
I mean, one could make the case that, you know, we talk about Francis Seow, the Marxist conspiracy. Is there a way to construct this kind of content to be more infotainment-like? Would that help? I mean, do you think that would be a very
I mean, it'll help you reach a different audience. I mean, there are experiments going on everywhere now, right? I mean, I've heard some of the best TikTokers are the ones who have their own book clubs or book recommendations and all that, and they are actually driving a lot of book sales through their TikTok videos. So I mean, that's an example of a good new media experimentation that is connecting people to you know, deep thinking and deep thought.
But what about your question about medium is the message?
Yeah, well,
I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I want to bring up something about TikTok that I read recently.
Okay.
Apparently in the US, doctors have reported this incredible rise in girls coming into the clinics with Tourette's symptoms. And they're wondering, where is this coming from? They finally linked it to TikTok. Apparently there's like, you know, millions
I don't know
of...
if you're laughing, but it is quite funny. It is quite
millions of
it's
TikTok videos
tragically funny
with you know, people with Tourette's, and apparently a lot of girls who are just watching this over and over again, they start developing Tourette symptoms themselves.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
But it's, you know, it's not so bizarre, because I actually like read in a book that in periods of history, people will go through these phases. Like in the 19th century, there was this sudden sort of like explosion of hysteria, women getting hysteria. And then in the 20th century, we have a lot of people getting back pain. And it's just historically very specific. And so the theory is that there are, at different stages of history, there are like socially acceptable ways for repressed feelings to come out. So in the 19th century, it's hysteria, 20th century, a lot of back pain, and then maybe in the 21st century, it's Tourette's. So.
Wow.
I remember something from where I read, could have been the book from Nicholas Carr, the one about what the internet is doing to our brains, and he definitely brought up this example about how in the beginning, when the book was first as a medium was created, there was actually a lot of skepticism about this, you know, like writing stuff in books. People preferred oratorical mediums of exchange versus writing stuff in books, and they actually frowned on books in the beginning. So, you know, maybe it's just always been the case that whenever a new form of techno media is introduced, people will form, you know, maybe unhealthy relationships or something like that, or skepticisms, but eventually it just gets, you know, absorbed and normalized.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. In my research on the newspaper industry as well, I found that it was in the early, from an Economist article, it was early 1600s in London, at the old St. Paul's Cathedral, which is where the first sort of newspapers came around, and the place was abuzz with all kinds of political talk, basically, right? And they used to call it, people called it the year's brothel. The year's brothel, right? So it's like every time, exactly what you said, every time a new format or medium comes around, you know, there'll be a lot of skepticism by people towards it, lah. I mean, in our generation, it's video games, right? Video games is the big one.
Yep.
You know, it's moved from like a horrible activity to now being seen as something that by a lot of people that's quite powerful and potentially educational as well. I mean, there are still people obviously who still piss on video games all the time, including China's government. But
the thing that you brought up was, you know, is this there's a quote by Marshall McLuhan, who's a Canadian theorist on the media, and he famously said, the medium is the message, meaning that it's not so much the content of what is being said that is important, but the form in which it takes. So, the same content could come in the form of a book or a podcast or a TV, and that form is actually the more important thing that we should be focusing on. And I think he generally looked at media as an extension of our nervous system. So every thing that we, TV, smartphone, a book, it is a way of extending our nervous system beyond our body. So by being able to, write something in a book, I can now pass it to you and become separate from my body, right? And so the idea is that when we create these new extensions of our nervous system, it actually changes our consciousness. So as we start consuming TV, as we start consuming video games or TikTok, our consciousness changes because we are now embedded in the different nervous system. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's...
I'll try and make that a little bit more empirical. Like for example, when it comes to say reading books versus reading an article on the internet, it's been found that you have better retention of information because you are not distracted by hyperlinks, ads, and people actually have better
WhatsApp messages from the mistresses.
That's right. It's actually in that same book that I talk about, which is called The Shallows. Now I remember the title. It was advocated that it's through long form reading that you actually improve your concentration skills and focus. Versus even if you read the same book on a tablet, right? You may lose actually some of these cognitive benefits because you're going to get distracted by all the stuff that I just mentioned. So that's the the heart of the argument.
And it's actually something quite critical, I think, to this moment in history where we are dealing with a lot of complex problems like the climate crisis, global inequality, which actually requires us to give it sustained, deep thought. And so this guy was saying that, it's only through mediums such as reading a book that we actually, our brain gets to that level of deep, sustained thought. And if we're constantly consuming stuff on a smartphone, we're constantly being distracted, we never get to that place. And so it's actually limiting our ability to think about the complex problems that we're facing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything. There was this funny comment from Zuckerberg, right? 8 years or 9 years ago when he first started his book club, he has a read a book a week or read a book a month or whatever it is. And he said something along those lines. He said, I've now realized that, reading a book is a great way to actually understand an idea. So everybody's like, oh, Zuck, you finally discovered reading books. And yeah, I think it's... The media diet that one plans for yourself is probably one of the most important things you can do in today's world. Seriously, it's I think it's always shifting. I find in my own consumption habits, I have started consuming a lot more video. So I've started learning a lot more from documentaries, from YouTube shows and things like that versus reading. How has that affected my consciousness, all that? I think it's a very interesting thing to think about. I don't know exactly how. I'm sure it has. It has. I don't know exactly how. But yeah, I think I pay a lot of attention to my media diet, planning my media diet, the same way almost that I do my regular food diet. It's important, and I think people need to do that. You can't just leave it to chance, right? And precisely because you have something so powerful in your pocket that's screaming at you from 50 different directions all the time. So if you don't have a proper media diet, I think it's very difficult to think and process all these deep issues like climate change that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Speaking of food and drink, I'm gonna take a break and pour you a drink because it's Christmas, So please keep talking.
That's very nice.
I was
of you.
actually going to jump in as well and say now to change our consciousness. This is what we can do.
I usually only start drinking at 3 p.m. Oh, it is 3 p.m. Oh, great.
Yeah, in fact, you're a little bit late now. It's getting to 4.
Okay, fine.
I do want to then go into this topic, which is about the fears of having a more liberal media landscape. right? And from one of your essays in this book, right, I'm quoting you right now, that greater democratization will benefit the country, and you write that while a growing number of Singaporeans do share this liberal view of democracy's imperative, quoting directly from you, there are many others in the country who are at best unconvinced and at worst believe democratic liberalization will spell the end of the Singapore fairy tale. So I want you to describe what kind of fears are you talking about, where do you think they come from, and how would you address them? Why do we have Singaporeans who are afraid of the country becoming more democratic?
Yeah, so it's related in a way to what we call in the book the Singapore consensus, right? So what is the Singapore consensus? It's that Singapore is naturally, intrinsically small, vulnerable, prone to manipulation by external forces or internal, problems, and so because of these natural, intrinsic factors, Singapore requires a different form of governance and leadership, right? It's not, you can't have the same sort of democratic debates that you might have in other places. You need a different form of political consensus, and good governance actually depends on that. And all the other things that we associate with the Singapore model, things like elite governance, rule by elites, all that flows from this idea about our natural inherent vulnerability. So when it comes to politics, for example, if we talk about why can't we have more democracy in politics, so the argument is often about if we have a lot more changes of parties, democratic pressures, our system will become prone to short-term electoral pressures, right? This election cycle, we decide to go for a 10 million population size. Next election cycle, party gets booted out. Okay, change plans, and this is actually what happens in other democracies, right? And Singapore being small, vulnerable, we need to have constant, stable government so we can implement long-term policies. So all this is part of the Singapore consensus, which is what I think scares people when they think about democratization. They connect the Singapore consensus with the growth and success and stability that they perceive has happened here, and then they fear that opening up will change it. Whereas our view, in the book, Donald and mine, is that Singapore, even if this was true at some ancient point in history, that Singapore was small and vulnerable, perhaps you could make a stronger argument for that, I think, in the 60s and 70s when we were a new nation state. So even if it was true at some point in time, I think in the Singapore of today, with a much more educated population, with the economy is much more complex, it's grown into a sort of a service knowledge economy. Actually, the sort of governance that we need is founded on good democratic debate and dissent, and that actually leads to better policies, partly because it allows us to draw on the distributed intelligence of people everywhere, right, as opposed to this kind of top-down formulation. So that would be our response to that actually, it's vulnerability and smallness is actually just a sort of a state of mind. There's nothing inherent or natural about it when it comes to Singapore. Sorry, just one last point, but in terms of, so to put it in very stark terms in the media, right? Let's think about what that would mean in terms of having a free, open, diverse debate. So let's pick a very, very pertinent, clear issue. What should Singapore's stance towards China be? Singapore-China relations, right? So the traditionalist school, which still predominates, is that we shouldn't have open debates in society, right? Which is why we don't. You don't see editorials in the Straits Times saying that, Singapore should do away with its ancient relationship with the US and prioritize relations with China. You would never see an editorial like that in the Straits Times. But our suggestion is that actually it's healthy for a democracy to have those open debates, right? You can have the China hawks, you can have the China doves, just let them go at it. That's how you engage people, that's how you get to a better place in terms of what Singaporeans want to do.
I think generally I would agree with that. I am beginning to question that, like, debate is the only or the best way of arriving at I don't know, better perspectives about the world. I think there are what I'm becoming aware of being involved in different groups is that debate and argument style of getting at the truth is suits some people, but there are a lot of people in this world who don't take to that form. And I think at the end of the day, what is most important to me is inclusivity, so that whatever style of politics we have, that it is genuinely inclusive of everyone. And if I follow that principle, it does mean, because a lot of people at the margins are not good at debating and you know, this style of conversation, right? So how do we include their voices? You know, how do we broaden the forms in which we I think you early on you used the word listening, right? I mean, really, like how do we have different forms of listening that are inclusive?
Yeah, no, it's very important. I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer, but that's ultimately it. We got to enhance the freedom to listen to all these groups in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue about debating is okay. So, I mean, I do think we need to make it more actualize this concept, right? Like, I do think that debate, for one, is a healthy component of a democracy. I think that's really one thing that we got to at least be comfortable with. And that kind of debate can be, very vexing. It can be very controversial. It can be polarizing, and I know that's something that you are very wary of. But I think, and I want to ask you, Sudhir, that question, whether you think that's fundamentally just a part of a democracy. And I think also at the same time, when we talk about listening, right, like the only way that we can be more inclusive, where we can include all sorts of different voices, going back to the media freedom issue, is that other groups, right, have a chance to set up their own media channel. Because you talk about just now, like how there are all this domination by corporations or governments in the media landscape. So a good example to me that I've learned is that why don't we have a real labor press, right? We have a business press, but we don't have a labor press, right? So to me, it's like you got to allow all these different groups, right, who are marginalized, the ability, the legal freedom to set up their own media channel. It can be a YouTube channel, it can be a magazine, but the idea is that they should be able to do this. Yeah, and as long as they don't have that kind of freedom, we cannot talk about a landscape that is really inclusive and diverse to begin with.
Yeah, but so I mean, I guess, I mean, not to sound too trite, but I guess in a way that's the liberating power of the internet, right? Many people have been able, I mean, despite all the downsides that we've spoken about, I mean, many people do have the ability today. You guys and me, being prime examples, do have the ability today to reach a broader audience. TikTok and other short form video content, for all the criticisms, they have allowed many people from less privileged parts of the world to access an audience and do something. I mean, that's why TikTok is very popular in places like India and all that. I think India has banned it, but before it was banned, it had this democratizing, liberalizing power, right? That it gave people access to a platform where they could share their views. So yes, I think it's important. Singapore, for sure, we need much stronger labor voices. Yeah, for sure. What form that takes, I don't know lah.
But imagine this, right? I mean, let's just have a real thought experiment here. If suppose a group of SIA pilots decide to create their own YouTube channel to talk about their labor grievances, I mean, would that even fly? You know what I mean? Because that's what I mean about real freedoms, right? This is hypothetical, but yeah, just imagine you take a real group of workers who are going to complain about a mega corporation, right? And let's assume that everything they say, everything that they air is quite legitimate. Or a real case in America where the Amazon workers are organizing and getting together to form, some kind of new trade union contract with Amazon. So what I'm saying is that do workers have that kind of power, right? Because it's one thing to create their own YouTube channel, but that's really nothing, isn't it, at the end of the day? And they could even be taken to task, whether it's with POFMA, we haven't talked about that yet, or other kinds of legal instruments that could curb their freedoms to express themselves?
We have a long way to go, lah. We have a long way to go. There are some examples I can think of, but I think they are almost like the exceptions that prove the rule. So like I know the medical circles, partly because I have a lot of friends who are doctors, but also both my parents are doctors. And there's a very popular blogger in the medical sphere. It's completely anonymous. I think goes by the name of the Hobbit. So I think the blog is Hobbit SMA or something like that. And this person, whoever he or she or they are, they actually write on very pertinent issues affecting the medical community in Singapore, right? But which ordinary doctors are too afraid to speak up about. So again, this is why I say almost the exception that proves the rule, because doctors as a group are a very powerful group, very wealthy, powerful group, but they're also obviously afraid to speak up themselves. So they've got this person, nobody really knows who this person is, but speaking up on these issues. And that's just one example of a group that has now, over the past, it's been going for the past like decade or so, that has found an outlet through the internet to talk about their issues that affect them, which would not have been possible in the old Singapore, right? But again, it's like I said, we're still so far from an ideal situation where different groups feel they have the ability and voice in order to speak up. At the end of the day, it also gets to, why are there so many bureaucrats who self-censor? Why are there so many, people who are afraid to piss off the government? I think ultimately it just gets to our vision of the Singapore dream and what we value in life, lah. If too many people value, the job, the status, the money, there'll never be people willing to come out of that and like ask the hard questions, lah.
I have a personal anecdotal story about that, but just to offer also support to your example about the doctor, the anonymous doctor, there is also a anonymous nurse account.
Okay.
So it's called, I think, SG Floringale or Nightingale, something like that. But my nurse friend subscribes to it, so I've taken a look at the account, and it's also anonymously created. And it's basically like an airing of grievances from the nursing community, because obviously they've been extremely stressed, taxed, and
there was one who committed suicide recently. I read
correct,
about too.
Correct. Yeah.
Indian girl,
yes,
Malaysian Indian girl.
Yes,
I think.
this just came up not too like last week or 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, so sad, man.
Yeah. So that's again another instance where, and of course the nursing community compared to doctors are a lot more underpowered. And again, I think it's sad that they have to create an anonymous account to just, and you can tell they probably will not get the demands met. It could be simple things like having higher wages, or having better support systems for or welfare for themselves. But it's just that human desire to express, just hear me out, right? I think that's such a intrinsic part of the human existence, and wanting a healthy society. Yeah.
But I think, you are really touching upon something quite interesting and mysterious here that I like to explore, which is like even the powerful, even those who you think have all the advantages find it difficult to speak up. And to me, that's a very interesting question to try and figure out what is holding us all back as a society from really being able to have the conversations and ask the questions that deep inside, like we really want to. And I can't remember if it was Milton or Blake who referred to the shackles of the mind, but that's what I feel, that even the powerful have these invisible shackles in the mind that they may not be aware of. And how can we, find a way to make them aware of it such that, they would rather not have these shackles.
Yeah. I feel in Singapore, we place such a high premium on material comfort. So if you think of hierarchy of needs, need to have your basic needs met before you can think, go up the pyramid, right? Right? But I think my view on Singapore is that what people consider that base need just keeps getting inflated and inflated and inflated, and that's why that's why a lot of people who are in potentially powerful positions where they can actually say something that would shed light on an issue or help to improve our democracy, help to improve the status of people at the bottom, they just don't want to because they for them the base need is their whatever, their detached house and their BMW, right? So it just keeps getting inflated, and they can't bear to step out of that. When it comes to the media, you all probably know that last 10 years there's like a sort of cottage industry of like ex-mainstream media people writing their biographies, writing their memoirs. I think P.N. Balji, who was a newspaper editor, recently wrote one. And I joked with Balji at his book launch. I was like, another journalist hack seeks redemption. That's what I told him. But when you read some of these memoirs, and they talk quite openly about how LKY interfered with editorial, and how they sometimes were wittingly or unwittingly turned into tools of the state, right? I don't know. It's not really apologetic. It's more just they're just describing the state of affairs. This is the way it is, and I think so many people are so conditioned by this PAP-led idea of what the good life is, right? And it's very hard to get out of that, lah. It's very, very hard to get out of that. But I think that's essential for Singapore to progress. It's actually essential for that to happen. Have a different conception of what the good life is.
Yeah, what I find depressing is, at the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned that you made a joke saying watching The Matrix was the first time that you realized the world was different, but that was The Matrix was 20 years ago, right, or around, and that was like an incredible film that I think introduced these ideas of questioning reality. And it is depressing to think that such a powerful film on an emotional, experiential level was just consumed as entertainment. And I imagine the person that you're describing here, whose material base just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you would hope that if they consume enough media like The Matrix or different films or experiences that make them question this reality, that would be a way for them to do that. But it doesn't, no matter how much media we consume, somehow to me it doesn't seem as if it makes an impact. And that's depressing to me.
Yes.
Can I just add on to that first?
Yeah.
Because I think
Go
this
ahead.
dovetails with something that I do want to talk about, which is I've mentioned in our correspondence that there is a famous 2016 clip of Stephen Chia of China News Asia, and he was in this closed door kind of a forum at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, and he was asked, and I'm quoting him directly, he said, "Do we do propaganda?" We do. And he considered that the media is not the watchdog of politicians, and they don't, there were two other journalists in the room with him, they all considered they do not try to hold people accountable. So, going back to what you said, right? So I think it's more about the people in power, and we're not necessarily talking about politicians, but journalists, editors, people who have ways to intervene in the media system. I mean, they are open-eyed, about the use of propaganda, but the as you said just now, they just justify the use of it. So I think that's the heart of the issue. I think they've gotten very comfortable with the use of propaganda, and they have no, maybe if they have a conscience, they write a book about it later on when they retire, when it's safe to talk about it. But while they're in the system, they become comfortable with it.
So you're basically saying that they are happy in the Matrix.
Yeah.
They know they live in the Matrix,
and
they're like, oh, this is great.
Yeah, what is that character
Yeah.
in the first Matrix? The guy who betrays them, Cypherus, right? When he's in a conversation with Smith, Agent Smith, and he says, he holds a stick in his fork. He says, "I know this stick is not real, but I'm going to enjoy it anyway." So I think that's kind of the heart of the human condition, right? So that's one. Then the other thing I wanted to say, just to add on to your comment just now about people having anti-PAP voices and stuff like that. So I was having a personal conversation with a friend, and he was also relating to me that he was in closed-door friendly meetings with people who are considered elite, let's say top 10% of the population. And he was very surprised. Actually, these people have very anti-PAP views, but they were afraid to have a more opposition fronted parliament, right? They still were very much wanted a PAP supported majority in the government, but they were very afraid of changing the status quo. And I'm just relating what the frustration of my friend here, because he felt like Singaporeans just don't seem to get it. If you really want to change the system, you got to be able to bear some turbulence. Maybe there's some, for the next 5 years, Singapore would be in a very disorganized would not be the right word, but definitely there'll be a lot more
there'll be chaos,
right?
Animals on the street.
Yeah. But it's just a necessary part of that development to get to where you want to go, that mature democracy. So maybe that's the question, right? I think as long as we are afraid of broking some dissent, some disturbance in the force, then we're never going to get there, right? And maybe it's a question for citizens as well.
Yes, well, there's a lot. So let me. I used to think that in terms of a democracy, because obviously that liberal democracies everywhere are failing in their own way, right? So nobody really right now is a poster child for democracy. So we can get to a longer discussion about different forms of democracy. I mean, China calls itself a democracy as well these days. But I used to think in Singapore's case that I would be fine with a single party dominated parliament if we had a strong independent media that could question and criticize, if we had freedom of information acts that allowed us, I think I would be fine with a PAP dominated parliament in that case, because I think the informational channels would be enough that people would know what's happening, and if they wanted to vote out the PAP one day, they could, right?
In fact, you said that you consider yourself a moderate. You said that you don't consider yourself a radical because you still want to see a conservative party in power. I remember you making that comment in one of your podcasts.
So I've always had the view that that the best political makeup for Singapore right now is with the PAP in power, but less than 2/3, right?
Yeah.
So that they can't change the constitution, because they made some very bad changes to the constitution. I mean, the big recent one was with the 2017 presidential election. But I think my view on that is starting to change, I'm increasingly I mentioned single party dominated with the my view on all that is starting to change, because I think increasingly that it's impossible to get both Singaporeans at an individual level out of this mind trap of fear of the unknown. I don't know what to do, and so we have to maintain the PAP in power, both at an individual level but also at a societal level. I think because of the PAP's tentacles, right, which I'm increasingly conscious of, and how it spreads across so many facets of society, not just universities but civil service, employment, and all sorts of things. I'm increasingly of the view that the PAP probably has to lose an election once in order for Singapore and Singaporeans to break out of this mental comfort zone we've been in for the last 50 years. And the PAP might come back to power after one cycle out, right? And it's fine, but I think just that one break would actually, I'm increasingly of the view, would be very beneficial for Singaporeans on so many levels.
Something else? I have one question, but you go.
You can go ahead.
Okay, so basically in your book, right, it goes back to something.
Oh, and sorry, and let me just add a little bit to that, which I think will help people understand the media question a bit better as well. We had this happen in Malaysia, right? Barisan Nasional lost an election for the first time. I think it was 2017, I want to say.
Yeah.
And that's when Mahathir and his new coalition came to power. And now Malaysian politics is in a mess right now. But I just want to talk about the psychological importance of that break. It was the first time in history that Barisan was no longer ruling Malaysia, right? And that had a very powerful psychological effect on Malaysians, but especially the media. The media became a lot freer essentially after that. They were always in hock to that one coalition or party, right? Anyway, so I suspect in Singapore the same will happen if if and when the PAP loses one election, I think the media will become a lot freer.
It is a great example. So what I wanted to do was follow on from that was both, I want to push back a little bit. You and I also realized Cherian George have this prophecy in mind that you think that the PAP will split, that there could be some potential splinter within the PAP, something that's, you know, we can consider a bit more progressive or left wing, might divert away from the main party. But we just talked a bit just now about how people who are in positions of power will be very, very reluctant to, you know, change their minds. So how do you square that? I mean, how do you think that's even possible?
I mean, I don't think it's like a likelihood lah, you know. I don't think it's a likelihood. I think it's one possible outcome, depending on a bunch of other things. But I don't think the probability is very high of the PAP splitting. It's just when people look forward, it's just one of the many on the table.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're starting to focus on the democracy aspect of this conversation, and you earlier mentioned that, there's no government or liberal democracy out there that's kind of the poster child of democracy, and I was wondering if you were to reimagine democracy or a better version of it, like what would it be? What would it look like to you?
That's a big question.
That is a big question.
Well, maybe let me first ask you to be more concrete with your idea about there's no poster child, right? I mean, there's so many countries out there that are, so to some degree, democratic. So we haven't even talked about Scandinavian countries, Australia, Japan, Taiwan. I mean, there are all these different countries out there, right? Can we really, I mean, every country has its problems for sure, but there is a certain kind of standard, right? We can see a realistic standard that we can reach for. And I mean, many a times our Singapore leaders talk about they want to be like the next Switzerland or the next, name some other Scandinavian country, right? They like to promote themselves that way. Corina, who we had as a guest previously, she used in one of her videos the example of Japan having the model elder care system. So I mean, I think there are examples that we can peel off from, but the question is that we have to create our own mix, I assume. Isn't there something out there that looks close enough to what you would like?
I mean, I sometimes use Taiwan, Switzerland, and Israel as possible models for Singapore, lah, right? And I mean, I use them for different reasons, right? You know, because there's no perfectly comparable place to Singapore. So, you know, I use Israel because for people who believe in the vulnerability ethos, who believe that we are surrounded by aggressive, larger Muslim neighbors who might attack us any day, Israel is a very relevant example, you know. Israel has had a thriving democracy with a very free media for decades, right? Changes of party lah, all kinds of chaos in parliament, outside of parliament, and that hasn't affected their ability to present a national security front. Right? They're still completely united when it comes to external defense and security. So, you know, that argument actually doesn't hold water. The argument made by the Singapore hawks that you know, one reason we need to maintain this very autocratic whatever practices is because we're surrounded by, you know, that doesn't hold water. So Switzerland and Taiwan also, you know, again, similarities for their own reasons. So yes, I mean, I was just being a bit like playful with the earlier comment that, you know, there are no liberal democracies out there. But I do think that we can strive towards something like that. What Singapore should be doing, of course, you know, people who study democracies, they like to use this thing called input and output legitimacy. So input legitimacy refers to the processes that get people into power to lead the country, how you elect your representatives, the rules of your elections and things like that. That's your input legitimacy. Output legitimacy is something that autocratic states, illiberal democracies talk about a lot. So that's your actual performance, right? That's your output legitimacy. Do you actually deliver goods and services efficiently to your people, your constituents? So that there's the input side and there's the output side. And you know, China of course likes to talk now about China has had less than 6,000 I think COVID deaths, right? That's a population of 1 billion. The US is almost 1 million now, if I'm not wrong.
Close to that.
Yeah. And so, you know, then the question is, in terms of output legitimacy, you could argue that, you know, China is serving its constituents much better than the US has, at least in terms of COVID performance. So these are the sorts of arguments that people who want to push for one model of democracy or another talk about. In Singapore's case, I mean, I think there are very clear things that we need to do. We totally need to improve a lot of aspects on the input side, input legitimacy, the rules of our elections, the platforms, how we treat opposition parties, you know, electoral commission, is there transparency around gerrymandering and redrawing of lines? There's so much work to be done there. There's so much work to be done in terms of the way the different stakeholders and agencies and bodies and all that kowtow to the PAP effectively. You know, there's so much work to be done there. Those are things I think we can work on to help build a better democracy here. I'm kind of answering your question in a very Singapore-specific way because, you know, what's my idea for a better democracy or ideal democracy? But
yeah, I actually kind of like that framing of input legitimacy and output legitimacy, and you know, it's obviously drawing upon economics for, you know, this language. And if you look at economics, there's a lot of economists like Kate Raworth who are questioning, you know, the current paradigm.
that's
Donut economics,
okay.
you're right, where it's like we are so focused on the output, on growth, right, that we neglect the fact that our inputs are finite and limited. And so in economics, there are a lot of contrarian thinkers now that are suggesting that we should really just focus on the inputs because it's finite and we should be limited by what our inputs allow us. And so I think that would be an interesting perspective to bring into politics, that, you know, for the time being, let's just forget about output. Let's really just focus on the input, you know, and limit ourselves to what our input legitimacy gives us. And maybe that's all that matters. I don't know. I mean, you know, it's such a fresh concept for me, but I'll have to think about it. But that's what I'm thinking right now.
I mean, basically, but I mean, I mean, it's interesting. I definitely agree on some senses, but that's what the autocrats would push back, lah. The autocrats would say that output legitimacy is all that matters, lah.
Yeah.
And you know, you're chasing airy-fairy ideals by focusing on input legitimacy. You know, as long as you have the right administrators in power who can deliver public goods and services, that should be enough, lah. You know, which is again the CCP way of thinking about life, lah. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we should come to a close, right?
Yeah.
So I have one last question. So I prepared this for you. So from your blog, I'm going to quote you, okay? Because you asked about what's a model Singapore maybe, perhaps for Sudhir, right? So I'm quoting you, Sudhir. You said, "Faced with the stark reality that no country is perfect, I still dream foolishly that Singapore can change enough to lead the world towards a future society where equality and fairness reign, where color doesn't matter, where people can love whomever they want, where relationships trump all else, where waste is minimized and wonder maximized, where crazy is a virtue and busy a vice, where anybody can speak about anything, where politicians serve people, where one can eat both laksa and lasagna." So I think it's safe to say we can eat both laksa and lasagna on the same table. I think that's okay. I think we've solved that. But you know, everything else that you listed, right, as your outcomes, all right, all these indicators, equality, fairness, color doesn't matter, people can love whoever they want. Actually, I would argue that people can love whoever they want, but they just don't have the legal means to marry. That's the more specific goal. Politicians serving people, all that. So, I mean, what I'm going to ask you as the last question really is that it seems that in order to advance, to meet these goals, we need a media that can represent, for example, LGBTQ, ethnic minorities in positive and affirmative ways. Politicians can be freely criticized and taken to task by voters and citizens. And the values that the media produces actually uphold those virtues of what you want: equality, justice, creativity, and authenticity. So going back to something you said earlier, don't we have a long way to go? And And besides even changing structures, right, don't we actually have to transform our social norms and even legal barriers, for example, like being able to present LGBTQ members in a positive way in media as well?
I think a lot of the work is being done on independent channels online. I think Instagram commentators, the likes of Wake Up Singapore, for example, are doing a lot in this direction. In terms of institutional, structural, legal, the problem I have is that, I mean, the answer is yes, of course, there are things that need to be addressed, 377A needs to be repealed. I mean, there's like a big obvious example, but because it's just this weird legal fudge that nobody really knows what to do, how to operate under. But I unfortunately don't see any of that changing anytime soon, unless there's a change.
So really, don't you think opposition politicians need to take up this task? For example, there was some criticism that the Workers' Party was not trying to be more proactive in LGBTQ efforts, for example. Don't you think that to some degree they have to be the forerunners, basically? Because no one else, the PAP certainly isn't going to do it.
I would like, as somebody who likes the Workers' Party, I would like for them to push a bit more on some of these issues, for sure. There's no doubt about it. I'm a bit disappointed that they take the pragmatic route, which is like, let's not disturb stuff that might potentially lose us votes, essentially. I think that's their viewpoint on 377A, for example, right? We want to be PAP light to capture some of their voters, but let's not provoke on some of these social issues that might make them unhappy, which I think was Tan Cheng Bok's position as well. So I'm disappointed, but from a purely electoral perspective, is their position on that a smart one? It might be I don't know, right? I don't know enough about the Singapore electorate to make that call. I'm not saying it's right. Like I said, I disagree with it, but I mean, it's. So I guess the question is, do we want an opposition party that tries to win power as soon as it can, or do we want an opposition party that pushes for values that we believe speak to equality and fairness? And I believe the followers will be divided on that question, I don't know. I really don't know. It's not an easy question to answer, unfortunately.
Yeah. Anyway, we could probably talk on for hours about this topic. I think for my closing, I want to go back to George Saunders' essay, because I'm such a big fan of it. And he imagines this megaphone, which is the media, as having two dials. One controls the intelligence of what is said, and one is the volume. And he said, currently what we have is the volume's turned all the way up, so it's freaking loud, but the intelligence is dialed way down. And he says it should be the opposite, right? And so the last sentence of his essay is, turn this megaphone down and insist that what's said through it be as precise, intelligent, and humane as possible.
I hope we attained that today.
Well, I was also just gonna, give my appreciation to you for your contributions to the media landscape, because I do believe that it has been intelligent, precise, and humane. So
thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for coming on the show.
No, thanks for having me, and for the Christmas whiskey.
Cheers.
Cheers.